Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Anthony.
And this is Words and Numbers. Well, how you doing this week, Kent? What's new and exciting?
For all of the complaining we do about the government agencies and so forth, and particularly the TSA, I had a run-in with the TSA recently. You and I were talking at a Students for Liberty conference, which I recommend everyone, particularly if you're a student, get involved with Students for Liberty on your campus. They're a good group of people. But this was in Nashville. I was so excited. I'm flying out of Pittsburgh, and rarely flying out of Pittsburgh do I get a direct flight anywhere. And not only could I get a direct flight, but I could be in and out on the same day. So that means not having to take luggage and all of this. I was so excited about the thing. It's a 5 a.m. flight. So you get the 5 a.m. flight and you're out there. We do our talk and I fly back. I said, this is great. This is what I'm going to do. So I get out there to the Pittsburgh airport. Now, mind you, I had to get up at like 2 a.m. to get a 3 a.m. Uber to be at the airport an hour before, which would be 4 a.m., right? So there I am at TSA, pulled out my license, and it's my wife's. I had no other ID on me. I'm standing there with my wife's license.
Now, there's going to be a bunch of people, as there should be, who will ask you, how is that even possible? Do you people not have wallets? What's wrong with you?
No, I haven't carried a wallet since I was in high school. I mean, everything's electronic, you know?
Look what ended up happening.
So I said to the person, well, I've got a picture of my license on my phone. No, they don't want to see any pictures. So I thought at this time, I'm actually pulling out my phone to call you, James, and say, you're going to have to do the whole thing solo because I'm not going to be there.
But what a great presentation that would have been.
They were great in their very Pittsburgh manner. They said, hey, it's no problem. Just come over here. So they take me to the side and I sit down with some old guy who calls up his central office. And they're apparently at the central office. They know things about me. So he's asking me questions that only I would know the answers to. And he says, okay, he fills out this form. He says, you're going to have to go through the super security, where they pat you down in the whole business.
Full body cavity search for you.
So I said, all right, well, fine, but I said, look, what happens on the other end? When I want to fly back here, I'm going to have the same problem. He said, well, they should, and emphasis on the should, they should let you through following the same procedure you followed here. So I go and I do my thing with you in Nashville and head to the airport like 4 hours early. It was so early. I had a bag to check. I had brought some promotional stuff for Words and Numbers. I had a bag to check and I couldn't check it because you're not allowed to check bags more than 3 hours before the flight, right? So that's just error compounding upon error. So I had to just leave the thing that I was going to check. I go to the person at the TSA. I said, look, I don't have any, I felt like an idiot, right? I don't have any ID, this kind of thing. But the same thing, they were so nice. It's all right, come to the side and went through the whole process again. Anyway, the long and short of the whole thing is this experience reinforced in my mind the fact that while government agencies aren't responsive to consumers, not nearly the way that private businesses are, that doesn't mean that you don't get good service. It means that there's no incentive in place to weed out the bad service. But occasionally you run across people, as I did in this case, who are reasonable people doing their jobs in a reasonable way, trying to do the best they can, and they helped me out and I got through.
It's a strange thing that you would mention all of this now, because I really just started traveling again over, the last 2 months. And I have noticed that the TSA agents are behaving differently.
Really?
I have noticed them to be kinder, to be more patient, to be less obnoxious. I don't know why it is exactly, and maybe they'll forget all about behaving nicely as more and more people travel, but I'll take what I can get at this point. Your story, though, could have been much, much worse, right? You could have not even made it to the gate, but even if you made it to the gate, it might have been worse because Southwest canceled about 1,000 flights each day, right around the time you flew. So there you go, right? You could have been stranded for all kinds of reasons.
Well, the funny thing was, I'm standing there. So once I finally got in, and I'm seeing all these Southwest flights being canceled, and I'm doing the math, counting up how many are canceled versus this. Is 1/3 of them on the screen were canceled. So I'm figuring, my probability here is 1/3 to be canceled. But if you plot them out on a map, all the canceled flights we're coming from are going to this circle of cities from Chicago down to Houston, over to southern Florida, and up the East Coast. So right in the center of that circle, pristine and untouched, Nashville and Pittsburgh. And lo and behold, the flight was fine.
I'm going to ask you a question. Think back to the Trump years, all 4 of them. Do you remember, perchance, what his approval rating was for almost the entirety of his presidency?
I thought it was in the high 40s.
About 43, more often than not. Right? That's just about the floor that he settled in on. And a number of other presidents spent a lot of time at about 43 as well. I'm not going to get into all of them. You can go look them up if you want. I'm using Gallup data here. It tends to be pretty good for things like this. But you can go to 538 and look it up there if you think that there's somehow a bias in the numbers. Which brings us to a very interesting point. What do you suspect Joe Biden's rating is right now, given that we're not even a year into his presidency?
I don't know, but I think you mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, and at the time you mentioned it, he was below 50%.
He's at 43. And something interesting is happening here. Why is it that presidents seem to get this floor? They don't drop too much below it, and they rarely go all that much above it. I think it's unmistakable. He's down from 57% in January, so right about when he took office. And that mirrors more or less what he had accomplished in the electorate. It's a little rosier at 57 than it was on the ground. But he went on a kind of a straight run down from April forward. If you start asking some questions, we're back to Ms. Jen Psaki again. She claims that there is, quote, no question that the continued pandemic is impacting Biden's numbers. See if you can keep up with me here. That same pandemic that seems to be over, that has you and me on the road again, me going to concerts again, you going to restaurants again, that pandemic,
right?
The one that no longer exists, the administration says, yeah, that's the right answer. That's why no one loves us. If you dig a little bit under that, you start to realize that Biden had a pretty ambitious agenda early on. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. We're going to spend $3.5 trillion, blah, 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 blah. Turns out he hasn't gotten any of that through in any reasonable sense of the word. People are starting to remember promises he made that are not being fulfilled. And I would submit that everybody in the country thought, oh, God, finally, not Trump. Fair enough, I thought that too, but I never thought, yay, Biden. And that's where a number of people made their mistake. And right about now, everybody's realizing it, and we're right back to normal. And I think 43% is, in fact, the new normal. We're going to have that almost forever.
I wonder how much of it is sticker shock. It's one thing to cheer during the election. He's going to do all these various things. But then after the election and the hangover sets in, you realize that we've got to come up with an extra $3.5 trillion. That's going to be more taxes and this and that. I wonder if it's some form of buyer's remorse. One of the things that I find interesting is I don't see him on the news. I don't see him making speeches. And apparently he's been refusing to answer questions from the press.
The not appearing in public so much anymore draws my attention to the few appearances he does make. It's almost always a little embarrassing. He is losing a step on his thinking, and I think they're trying to keep him out of harm's way by putting him way, way away from the cameras. If I'm right, we'll know for sure very quickly. Woodrow Wilson had his wife become president for him, right? Mm. Ronald Reagan, in those last 2 years, everybody from the inside of that administration years later said that he had really taken leave of his senses. These are the things that happened. With Wilson, it was from a stroke. With Reagan, it was from Alzheimer's. We'll see where it all goes, but he's not doing so well right now, and there seem to be a number of different reasons for it. This brings us to the foolishness of the week, and it's not going to be Joe Biden. We're not getting back to Donald Trump again, although we are going to pick a person who transcends those two administrations. Our old friend Anthony Fauci is back at it again. He actually admitted, about a year ago, to lying because the ends justify the means. He wanted people to behave in a certain way, so he lied. Sorry, where I sit as a good small R Republican, you give people the facts and then they live the way they want to live. But here comes Anthony Fauci telling us, enjoy Halloween, that you can take your children out and trick or treat at the end of the month, as if we were all waiting with bated breath to hear what Fauci would tell us about Halloween.
Oh, enjoy it as in you don't have to worry about COVID. Just go and...
Yeah, as long as you're outside wearing your mask, it's okay. Well, how did we get stuck with this guy? Unbelievable. Halloween is acceptable.
I've seen this amongst academics. They get so steeped in their subject that they come to think that the entire world revolves around whatever it is that they do. I can't help but wonder it's a similar thing with politicians, maybe some bureaucrats, certainly Fauci in this instance, that his life has been 24/7. The COVID and contagion and all of this, and issuing directives as to what we should and shouldn't do, that it's hard to let go. What do you do at the end of that when COVID's over? It's like a general at the end of the war. What now?
I think it's even sadder than what you're asserting here. He's been with the government for so long that I don't think he realizes that a lot of us don't care. A lot more of us don't trust anything the government says anymore. Do I think the people who are anti-vaccine are out of their minds? Indeed, I do. Do I think it's unwarranted? No, I don't think it's unwarranted. I think they've heard enough lies by the government for enough years that they're just not going to believe anything that these clowns say ever again.
Right.
And that I understand. I'm 100% certain that the vaccines are not a problem. Do I think people who don't think that are somehow blameworthy? Yeah, I do. Do I think it's warrantless? No, I don't think it's warrantless at all.
Mm-hmm.
I understand exactly why they don't trust the government. I never trust the government either. I do trust, as luck would have it, the companies that make vaccines. It's a lot easier for me to trust Pfizer. Incidentally, I'll be going for a booster shot next week at some point. Because you got to keep the COVID away year after year after year now.
Yeah, this is going to be an ongoing thing, I'm afraid.
Anthony Fauci, you win.
To get more Ant and James, buy a copy of our excellent book, Cooperation and Coercion. You can find the paper and electronic versions on Amazon and the audio version on Audible. We've had some questions about our Saturday bonus material, which we were doing for a while, kind of as an experiment. We've moved the Saturday bonus material over to our Patreon account, so if you join there, you can get more Ant and James. It's at patreon.com/wordsandnumbers. We had such a good time discussing Exchange last week that we ran over time and ended up cutting the conversation into two parts. So if you haven't heard it yet, listen to last week's part 1 of our conversation on Exchange, and this week is part 2. More and more I come to realization that I don't think people understand what Exchange is about. I want to think about this moratorium. I came to the realization, I wasn't aware of this. I thought that the moratorium was that you didn't have to pay rent. That's not the case. It's a delay of the rent. So all of these people who went these months without paying rent, they're now expected, now that the moratorium's lifted, to pay for all those months that they weren't. So all of a sudden, you're going to have people hit with multi-$1,000 bills.
They're not going to pay it.
No.
They're not going to pay it. They're going to end up in bankruptcy.
Well, that's the interesting thing. I mean, suppose you're a renter and you say to the landlord, look, you want $6,000 for this back rent. I don't have it. So what are you going to do? Throw me out? You're going to get somebody else in here who's also not paying you the $6,000. You're out the $6,000. That's it. That, I think, makes it even worse than I had suspected for landlords.
It does, and we've ended up at a place where, logically speaking, it might be better to consider the back rent the same way we consider student loans, that these are not dischargeable. You can't declare bankruptcy and walk away from this. People get all lathered up about student loans, but it's that very issue, the guarantee of the student loan, that allows them to exist in the first place to the degree that we have them. So if you begin with the mistaken assumption that everybody should go to college, again, mistaken, then you have to make it affordable for them. And the only way you think to make it affordable for them is to guarantee a loan. And that's a mistake too, but you can understand how these mistakes got made. All of a sudden, I'm looking at rent exactly the same way, but the aggrieved party isn't the government, which is the case in student loans.
Right, yes.
You can make a weak sauce argument that it's all of us together, but that's nonsense. But all of a sudden, it's a landlord left holding the empty bag. Mm-hmm. And if you want him to remain a landlord, and by extension all the others, you better find a way to get him his money. I don't think that's going to happen.
I don't know of any instance in which we've had something like this moratorium before. But we have had instances in the past repeatedly of cities imposing rent control. And the rent control has the same effect as this does. It takes away from landlords the incentive to provide housing.
It's absolutely perverse when you get to these big cities, because what you find is there's not enough housing for anybody.
Right.
The ripple effect goes through the entire housing market. And there are economists who study only this. And they always say, if you want to do maximum damage to a city, just implement rent control.
And I could recall when I was a student studying the rent control issue, there was an interesting case, and I want to say it's New York City, but don't quote me on that, in which the city imposed rent control, but the rent control applied to the landlord, not to renters who were subletting. So, for example, I might rent the thing at $500.
Oh my God, you gotta be
there,
kidding me.
Right, yeah.
I would be rich under those circumstances.
Well, that's what happened.
Not by owning things, but by but by not owning things.
To be clear, so for example, let's say that it's rent controlled at $500. So the landlord cannot charge more than $500. I'm renting the place for $500, and I can then sublet it. So I sublet it to you for $600. You pay me $600. I pay the landlord $500. I pocket $100.
But that's not it. You would be letting it out to me at about $2,500.
Well, that's the thing. In this case that I was reading, it was some situation of like 10 or 12 deep of subletters, of subletters, of subletters. And look at what's happening here. You've got the worst of both worlds, because at the end, you have high rent. Because what do I have to pay to get an apartment? I got to pay that subletter of the subletter $2,000. So it's still high rent, but it's not enticing landlords to provide more housing because the landlord is seeing none of that. It's all going to the chain of subletters.
And it's far worse than it would first appear to be, because by the time you get to subleases, who's on the hook for damage? And it's the original leasing.
It's the original guy, right? It's like the line of cars and the guy in the back hits the one in the front, who hits the one in the front. It's the guy at the rear who's responsible for the whole shebang.
That's right. And boy, this would be good fun, because I would have involved myself in this ill-conceived practice almost immediately. It would have taken like 8 seconds for me to pull this crap.
Yeah.
And here we are, and we're back to exchange. Exchange takes on so many wonderful forms, doesn't it?
You use the word wonderful, and I think that's it. Exchange is wonderful. It's two people getting together and saying, I want what you have more than what I have, and vice versa. And they both exchange and they're better off. And anything the government does to step into that and make it harder, by definition, makes people worse off.
Yeah, and it's funny, right, to consider now how government makes it easier from time to time. You and I don't make our living telling stories about how the government does good things. But nonetheless, here we are, because, we'll just talk about this fictitious man who lives here in Tucson. He's large and bald, and mustache and
angry,
beard, the whole bit. Mostly pissed off about most everything. But 2 years ago, he started looking around Tucson trying to buy marijuana.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't easy for a middle-aged guy to find, especially one that looks like a detective.
Oh my God, I hadn't thought of that, of course. Kojak here wants to buy something.
That's right. But then a weird thing happened, and government got out of the way of the market in marijuana.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, I wasn't risking jail time to go find it. Some guy wasn't risking much more jail time by stockpiling it and selling it. We decided here that what we should do is have these dedicated stores that sell only this. And you can go to that store all you want.
Mm-hmm.
And don't you know, everybody's better off on a number of different levels, not the least of which is that none of us have to go to prison anymore for doing something that never hurt anybody in the first place. The government backing out actually unleashed something that's very powerful and made everybody much, much happier. The people who don't want this to happen, well, they don't even have to think about it. It doesn't happen in their kitchens, so really, what's the big deal? And most of them had arguments against it early on, but as time went by and the stores opened and the commerce began, now they don't really have that complaint anymore.
They see the reality.
The hellscape never emerged. It's interesting to think, well, what might be next? Because this is one of the very first times in my life the government gave, and I mean government on any level, right? State, federal, local, whatever. They gave up a certain kind of authority, and they said, you guys work it out for yourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And don't you know, we did. It was easy. Given the dollar amounts in that market, it was very easy for people to work it out because everybody had a vested interest in getting up to the starting line. Our listeners might not know this. I have an acute sense of smell. I should have been the guy that works at the perfume company to smell things. But I can smell people smoking weed in their cars as they drive by me on the highway. That might not be great. It also might be passengers. So there are issues. I'm never going to say that everything is just wine and roses, but it's almost wine and roses. It's like soda and carnations, right?
So you're bumping up against the footnote I was going to put on our conversation, which is that we're saying that these transactions, they're good and both people are better off, and that's good for everybody, and the government shouldn't step in and stop that, with an exception. And the exception is when that transaction somehow is imposing a cost on a third party who has no say in it. That is a problem, and that is a place for government to step in, because what is government doing at that point is protecting the property rights of that third party who has no say in what's going on.
It's kind of like a neighbor who has a 24-hour-a-day party right next to your house.
Yeah.
You're probably well within your rights wanting that shut down. And so too, we have noise ordinances and the whatnot. There's always an obvious answer to things like this. The hard cases that come up are few and far between. And that's why we think about them so much, because they do. They stick out like a sore thumb. But most of the things that any two people are going to talk about, pretty easily dealt with.
They are pretty easily dealt with. And I think that should be the default. Instead of seeing a transaction and asking the question, well, who gave you permission for that? The default should be, yeah, of course you're having a transaction. Go for it. And only think twice about it if somebody external to the transaction is being harmed in some way.
And a reasonable assertion of harm.
Right.
I talked about this on Smoking Stories not too long ago. My neighbor in Greensburg, Pennsylvania, the town you and I lived in together, called the police because leaves from somebody else's tree were going into her yard.
Right. Arrest those trees.
What kind of defective lunatic must you be that that's what you'll call the police over? So go over to Smoking Stories and catch that if you want the entire story. It's actually quite funny.
Which you'll find on YouTube.
Yeah, that's right, YouTube.
Not podcast players.
Nope, not podcast.
Although, you should try that. You could put Smoking Stories, the audio, on a podcast player.
Somebody has figured out how to do that, and they're doing it without my blessing. I don't know how.
You're
but
kidding
I got
me.
Word.
Somebody's bootlegged Smoking Stories. Oh my God, I love it.
I got word last week that my nephew and nieces listened to it. How would you listen to it, right? It's a video. I haven't bothered to figure out what's going on there yet. What kind of outro do we really have here when we're talking about money and exchange? This is the magic that makes everybody's life possible. And how they routinely fail to see that is a mystery to me.
I repeat this so many times to people when they ask me questions like that. I say, stop looking at the dollars. Stop saying things like, well, this guy has lots of dollars, this guy has less dollars. Look at the exchange of goods and services and ask yourself who has what in terms of goods and services. And the beautiful example I give to students all the time when we talk about inequality is I say, all right, ask about dollars, and Steve Jobs had lots of dollars and we don't have lots of dollars, but look at cell phones. Everybody's got a cell phone. If you look at the goods and services, there's tremendous equality. It's not perfect equality, but it's tremendous equality.
Actually, Ant, I think it goes further than that because, okay, Jobs died with what? Almost $7 billion.
$8 billion.
So $8 billion. But add up all of the Apple products, and it's probably going to be about the same number if you know how these things work. But here's the thing. I would make the argument that it's so much more valuable in a way that you could really never account for using dollars. When you think about smartphones and the positive things that they've brought to our lives, we can communicate with people in oppressive regimes.
Yeah.
Their lives have changed.
Yes.
Because of a little rectangle that we can talk on. And there's no way to capture that value in terms of dollars. You're actually changing the lives of human beings for the better. And sometimes that's incalculable. You can talk about the time I've saved and this, that, and the other thing, but I'm fat and happy here in the United States. Go find me somebody in North Korea or China or Cuba or Venezuela. And now tell me that we can easily convert this to dollars and cents. Well, you can convert it to dollars and cents to some degree, but it's always going to miss something that's incredibly valuable. I would have us remember that when we think about these things. It's even better than it appears to be.
I'm glad you brought that up because this is another source of misunderstanding about exchange. And it's what I call an observation bias. It's really easy to point to, let's take Steve Jobs as an example in Apple. It's really easy to point to them and say, look at how much they benefited, because we can measure very clearly the amount of money they received for their iPhones, and we can subtract from that, also measured very clearly, the cost of producing those iPhones, the difference we call profit, and we measure that to the penny. We can point to it and say, look, that's how much they benefited. What we never do, because it's not as easily measured, is on the flip side. So I walk in to buy an iPhone, and let's say I pay $400 for the iPhone. How much would I have been willing to pay in a pinch? I really want this thing, and if the alternative was to walk away and not have it and never have it, all right, I'd pay $1,500. Well, hang on a second.
That's right.
The maximum I'm willing to pay is $1,500, and I got it for $400. I just walked away with an $1,100 profit. But we never talk about that because we can't measure it, but it's as real as the profit on the company side that we can measure. And so we come away thinking that somehow the companies are collecting all this profit, when in fact it's simply a matter that we can't measure the profit on the consumer side, but it's there nonetheless.
I know that I've told this story before, so if you've heard it, feel free to zone right out, but it's worth repeating here. One of the first times I went to Istanbul and I was walking around, it's my favorite place in the world, so I love talking about it. But I was walking around and there were no tourists. A shopkeeper tried to sell me something. And I said, nah, man, I can't buy anything where I'm going. I can't carry it. And he said, all right, come on in and hang out. I got nothing to do anyway. And I started hanging out in the store. And that's a beautiful opportunity to learn how things work in a place that you don't quite understand.
Yeah.
So I was poking at him from every direction, trying to figure out how he made a living. And I said, well, surely you sell mostly Turkish rugs, right? And there were a batch of them in the shop. And he said, those are from China. And I said, come again?
The Turkish rugs are from China.
Come again? And he said, oh, yeah. Up until about 5-10 years ago, I have a pickup truck. I used to go out and I'd drive from village to village to village. And these old ladies would sell me their rugs that they had made. And then I would bring them back here. I'd mark them up quite a bit and I'd sell them and I'd make a profit that way. But then something terrible happened. And I said, yeah, what? He picked up his iPhone and he said, this thing. And all of a sudden, I understood immediately what he was going to say next. Those little old ladies out in the villages, they found out what their rugs were really worth.
Yep.
And they started selling them themselves. And to the customer, this became a price cut because they went lower
right.
than the other guy used to, but way higher for them. It was a factor of some multiples higher, right? It wasn't like 20% higher. It was like 400 or 500% higher. That's the part we never see. That's the interesting part.
You're talking about the benefit that comes from here. So here's this phone and it facilitates communication. But with communication comes a dispersion of information, market information. Right. And all those women's lives were made remarkably better simply because of this cell phone.
Because they took that magic rectangle and went and found Etsy. And now you can just buy whatever you want. And I encourage you to go take a look. You can, in fact, find all of these people on Etsy. That's probably the happiest spin that I could put on any of this. It cuts layers of nonsense out to regular people, and they can make a better living than they could have made a month earlier.
And that's what economics is. You strip away all of the flummery with financial markets and money and interest and all of that. At its root, that's what it is. It's a woman who's made a rug and is going to exchange it to somebody else for what she wants more than the rug, and they're both going to walk away happier.
And she's going to make that sale in dollars or yen or rubles or euros, doesn't matter.
Whatever, the tool doesn't matter.
That's right, because once she's got those currencies, she could change it into any currency she wants with a simple PayPal payment.
Yeah, right, on that same magic rectangle.
Yeah, that's right. And she's going to get the bank rate that was reserved for $1 million plus transactions not more than 20 years ago. She's going to get the same deal those people always got. This is amazing.
Yep.
So when you ask, did Steve Jobs, for example, give us $8 billion worth of value? I would say, okay, he extracted $8 billion. The value went way beyond what he extracted.
Yes, the value was way beyond that.
It's light years past it. It's so different and so wonderful. And if you can't see that, you've been living in the United States a little too long. Maybe take a trip and go see how the rest of the world lives. That's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Be sure to join us next week, Wednesday at noon, as is always the case, for yet another episode of all of our favorite podcasts. Until then, you can follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes. You can join Words and Numbers Backstage, where the conversation continues, or you can be a total pain in the ass and do what Ant says next.
You can send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
We look forward to seeing you next week. And, until then, it's getting a little cool outside. It's nice. The leaves are turning in places where they have leaves. Where I live, not 105 degrees anymore. Enjoy fall just a little bit. We've got playoff baseball, we've got football, and we've got the great outdoors. There's nothing to be angry about right now. So be nice to each other. We'll see you next week.
See you next week, James.